I hope it's not a long introduction, but our speaker has been broadly interested in how birds are distributed across land and seascapes, and he uses that information to measure how their populations change and their communities are structured as those distributions are impacted by humans. Much of his research involves adapting citizen science data to address these questions, including studying how that data compares to more traditional forms of data collection. These projects range from mapping distribution of Antarctic and Southern Ocean seabirds to understanding how the decrease in human activity during the pandemic resulted in shifts to avian land use. Fundamentally, he is fascinated by the various reasons why species are distributed and where they are, and how new sources of data can expand our knowledge of those patterns to aid in monitoring and conservation. He received his BA in biology in German from Lawrence University in Wisconsin, Master of Science in Aquatic Fishery Sciences from the University of Washington in Seattle, and his PhD in ecology and evolution from Stony Brook University in New York. Please welcome Michael Schrimpf.
Thanks very much. I tried starting my video again, and I wasn't able to do that. So I don't know if you can adjust that, and then you can all see me. But otherwise, I'd be happy to get started. Let's try this again. There we go. Hello. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me come. It's an honor to come and talk to you today. I'm really happy to share some of the work that I've done, and hopefully I encourage you to ask questions once I've gone through some slides here. So I'm really excited to be here and happy to share my work with you. So let's do that and that. How's that? Is that working? You can see my slides? Excellent.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, my name is Michael, and I am a postdoc at the Cornell lab. I say at, I'm actually working remotely. I'm coming to you today from Winnipeg, Manitoba. I work remotely for the lab, and so I'll sort of talk a little bit about who I am. But basically what I'm going to talk to you today about is studying sort of open ocean birds, pelagic birds, using eBird. My background in birds goes back not as far as some people's did. I mean, some people started studying birds really early in their lives, grew up as young birders. I didn't really get interested in birds until college. I started to develop an interest in biology and ecology in high school. I wound up, as was mentioned, wound up going to a liberal arts college in Wisconsin called Lawrence University. It's a small college in Appleton, Wisconsin. There I started birding. That was mostly just something to do to get out and see the birds in the local area, get to know a little bit about natural history, because I felt like I wanted some more natural history knowledge as I was starting my career in biology. And I kind of got fascinated with birds. To be perfectly honest, when you're walking through Wisconsin in the winter, the birds are the most interesting thing to look at. So that's kind of what bugged me there. And then I had sort of also been developing this interest in aquatic and marine science. And I was working with a professor at Lawrence, studying small crustaceans, freshwater zooplankton, and algae and phytoplankton in local lakes. I come from, obviously, Milwaukee and Appleton, Wisconsin are both sort of very closely linked to the Great Lakes and other freshwater systems in Wisconsin. But I had this fascination with marine systems. I wound up doing an off-campus program that took me to sea when I was an undergraduate in 2005. And that was the first time I really got to see seabirds. And despite the fact I hadn't really had a lot of experience working with them, I decided that I might want to experiment working with seabirds. Maybe this would be something I'd like doing. So I I wound up moving to Seattle, Washington, and that's where I did a master's degree. And that was the first time I really started working with seabirds specifically. That was alcids. So I worked on common Murres, Rhinoceros auklets, a little bit of observational work on tufted puffins, but mostly the hands-on work I did was with common Murres and Rhinoceros auklets on some islands off of the Washington coast. And that was fantastic. It sort of gave me a really deep love for seabirds. I was really fascinated by their lives, by how they existed in the ocean environment. And so at that point on, I knew I wanted to keep studying seabirds. So I worked for a couple of years then, and then eventually wound up going back to do my PhD at Stony Brook. And that is where this photo comes from. This is obviously not Stony Brook. This is the Antarctic Peninsula. And I started working with Dr. Heather Lynch on some work involving trips to the Antarctic to study penguins and other seabirds in their breeding sites, on their colonies, all up and down the Antarctic Peninsula. Show of hands of those of you I can see in the picture. How many of you have been to the Antarctic? Has anyone taken a trip to the Antarctic yet? Is anyone hoping to take a trip to the Antarctic at some point? Excellent. So Antarctic tourism is becoming more and more accessible, more and more available to a lot of people. It's still quite expensive, but there's a good number of people now, tens of thousands, almost 100,000 people some years that visit the Antarctic in a given year, mostly all the Antarctic Peninsula. And that's kind of where my research has started to focus, and certainly my PhD research, and now continuing on at Cornell. So then we moved from Stony Brook in January of 2020, which was a fascinating time to move to a new city for a number of reasons. We moved to Winnipeg. My partner is also a seabird biologist, and she's doing her PhD here at the University of Manitoba. So I relocated here, and I've been working as a postdoc for a number of years now. And I'm actually just about to move again. We're going to be moving to Maine, where I'm going to be a visiting faculty member for 1 year at Bates College. So I'll be moving back to the Northeast, and will be sort of a little bit closer to you than I am here in Winnipeg. So that's kind of a little bit of history about me and how I sort of grew into the scientist that I am today, and what I picked up along the way, what sort of experiences I've had. So thinking about seabirds, we want to talk a little bit about sort of, oh, right, I was going to mention this. Because I'm coming to you from Manitoba, I figured I would share some recent birds. You've probably got more migrants than I do right now. The migrants are a little bit slower here. But this is my lifer great gray owl that I managed to pick up last weekend in southeastern Manitoba. So that's a fun thing to whet your appetite for birds. But anyway, that's the last land bird we're going to look at. We're going to talk about seabirds. So seabirds are really fascinating in a lot of ways. When one of the reasons why I feel like seabirds are really interesting is that just like all other birds, they breed on land, with the exception of the emperor penguin, which technically breeds on sea ice, but a solid surface. So all birds need to lay their eggs on something solid. No bird has evolved a pouch or something to carry their egg with it. So all seabirds are tied to shore. They are tied to land. But that tie is really specific and is often very short. The egg needs to hatch and the chick needs to grow, at least to some extent, on land. Some seabirds leave land very, very quickly after they hatch, after they are young chicks, they're precocial chicks. But most seabirds spend some amount of time growing up on land, maybe a couple of months. Sometimes in some of the albatrosses, it might be almost a year, but it's a good amount of time on land, or some time on land. But then they go out to sea. And some seabirds will be at sea for months or even years before they come back to land for the first time. The wandering albatross spends up to 3 or 4 years at sea before it starts returning to a colony annually or biannually to breed. And so when you think about seabirds, we tend to think of them sort of coming and going from colonies, coming and going from shore, because that's our human land-based perspective. But you really kind of have to see them as marine creatures. And if you've ever gone on a pelagic trip and watched seabirds on the open ocean, you'll kind of get an appreciation for what I'm saying. They look very different. Many of them are very ungainly, very awkward on land. but at sea, there's something else. They're in their element at sea. So that's an important aspect of what a seabird's life is like. So they've got this land-based sort of lifestyle, and because they are so awkward on land, often those colonies are located in places which are very hard to get to. That means that it's hard for predators to get there as well, and that's one of the biggest conservation threats to seabirds these days is introduced predators, and that's the thing that most seabird conservation programs that are happening on a colony are in some way involved with predator control or eradication of, say, rats from seabird breeding colonies. Now, this is a picture I took in the island of South Georgia, and it's actually a small island just off of the main island there in the background, and it's a wandering albatross colony. So that's how we often think about these birds. But to really understand their biology and to understand their lives, we really need to know about them on the ocean at sea, and particularly where they are at sea, because where they are reflects sort of what they're doing and what kind of resources they use. Seabirds, when they're at sea, often they are feeding. They're either looking for food or they're eating food. Sometimes they're traveling to and from. Sometimes they go through areas where you would call it a migration, where they're traveling through an area solely for the purpose of getting from point A to point B. But for the most part, most seabirds are out looking for food. And so if they're spending time in one part of the ocean, that's probably because there's some sort of resources there. That is another one of the important conservation threats that seabirds face, obviously, is food resources. But particularly, a lot of birds will tend to go after bait on hooks. And so bycatch in the fishing industry is another big important sort of source of seabird mortality. Because many of these birds are long-lived, they tend to have few young per year. They really need to have high adult survival in order to maintain a positive population growth. And that means that any sort of increased threat to the adult survival, say, for example, from the occasional bird getting hooked by a fishing line, that could potentially have pretty serious consequences for their populations. And so understanding where they are on the ocean to help figure out what kind of threats they're facing at that time of year. Is there overlap with the fishing industry from one species versus another? That's another reason why studying their lives on the ocean is really important. Seabirds are also really useful to get us to learn more about the ocean itself. And the main reason for that is that, obviously, most of what goes on in the ocean happens out of view from us. It happens underneath the water's surface. Which means that there is quite a lot of there's a lot of mystery, a lot of hidden things that are hard to pick up on if you aren't able to see it directly. And we have ways of doing that. We can send boats out with sonars that can look at fish underneath the ocean. We can tow nets through the water and collect various samples. We can do observations of things that do come to the surface, like marine mammals, but it's very difficult to understand what's going on under the ocean, and it's very time and cost expensive to do that, to collect those data. Seabirds, because they're feeding from the ocean, and often because they're spreading out over a large area to do that, they're actually sampling the ocean for us, and so a bird may travel hundreds of miles to go out and feed. And if you're at a colony, you might have lots of birds, thousands of birds, all going out to the surrounding ocean to feed, coming back to the colony. And so you can actually use seabirds as sentinels or indicators of what's going on in the ocean. And this is a really interesting paper that was published a few years back, about a decade ago. And they were able to show that the proportion of particular fish species in this one particular seabird's diet was highly correlated with the CPUE, stands here for catch per unit effort. It's a fisheries term, which is basically relative to how much fishing is going on, how much are they catching. It's a way to basically have an indicator of the size of the population, how many fish there are. And the proportion in the seabird's diet was closely related with the catch per unit effort, But that's not the really interesting thing. The really interesting thing is that the proportion in the seabird's diet in 1 year was related to the catch per unit effort in the next year. So if they were measuring the proportion of, say, sardine or anchovy in the seabird's diet in 2024, that would allow them to predict how much fish the fishing industry would catch in 2025. That is extraordinarily valuable because it means that you can set things like catch limits or take active management for the future and not for the past. And the reason why this is happening in this particular case was because these birds, much like a lot of seabirds, are actually feeding on the young fish. And so the birds are feeding on the young fish. Those young fish then in the following year are going to turn into the adult fish that the fishers are going to catch. And so this is a really interesting way. And this way you don't have to go out and tow a bunch of nets, really small mesh size, to try and catch a lot of juvenile fish, which has all sorts of other potential problems with it, not to mention the fact that it's very time intensive. Here, all you have to do is send a couple of field biologists to a seabird colony for the summer, have them monitor what the birds are bringing back, how the birds are doing, and that will tell you something about, how to manage that fishery. So seabirds can be really, really useful for a lot of reasons. So a lot of the work that I've done is sorry, I just pulled up the chat here and I saw Judy's question there. In the brown skua photo, is the bird going after a fish? That is a great question. I'm not exactly sure what that is. It's kind of hard to tell. This does look like fish, but it looks like a fillet or something like that. So I'm not really sure if that was something on a pelagic trip that someone was tossing over the side, or I don't know why you'd toss a whole fillet over the side. I might as well just toss the other bits. But anyway, yeah, it's a little unclear to know what this brown skua is eating. I'll try and have the chat window open here, so if anyone else has questions, I can address. So yeah, so I do a lot of work in the Antarctic. So this is Antarctica, and when I travel aboard sort of tourist ships to go to the Antarctic and work down there, I often show this slide, and then I talk about sort of Antarctica being our destination. But we've actually got two destinations on these sorts of voyages. We've got Antarctica, which is amazing and is a great place to visit and really exciting things to see. But we also have the Southern Ocean. And I see the Southern Ocean as a distinct, but still very valid destination. A lot of people think about the ocean as something you need to cross to get to where you want to go. I think of the ocean as the place where you want to go, in addition to the Antarctic, which is also a place that you might want to go. And so that's the way I look at it, because on the ocean, you can see all sorts of things that you can't actually see once you get down to Antarctica itself. If you want to see a wandering albatross, you're going to see it in the middle of the Southern Ocean. You're not actually going to see it from land in Antarctica. So that brings us to eBird. I'm at the Cornell lab. We're going to talk about eBird. I'm not really going to go through what eBird is. I'm going to assume that all of you know what eBird is, and if you don't, turn to your neighbor and ask them what eBird is. I'm sure they can explain it to you. But something about eBird I think that's really interesting is sort of where we see eBird observations. And this map is now a few years old, but it's the same basic patterns are still fairly apparent. There are a lot of data in North America, some places more than others, obviously. Places with people get a lot more data. And it's catching on in Europe and certain other places. India is quite popular in India and growing in popularity, quite popular in Australia and New Zealand. But if you look at the places where there aren't a lot of data, there's not a lot of data in the Sahara Desert, makes sense. Not a lot of data in Siberia, not a lot of people there. Not a lot of data on the oceans, especially the open ocean. There are a few places where we get, obviously, these are people going to and from Hawaii, and these are people visiting some of those South Atlantic islands. That there's some interesting cruises you can take to those places. Some people crossing the Atlantic, but for the most part, the open ocean is very data deficient. Not a lot of data. So if we want to use eBird from the open ocean, we need to think about it maybe a little bit differently. We can't necessarily do the same things that we do on land. One place where there is a decent amount of data is down here in the Southern Ocean. And that's partly because of the popularity of tourism to and from the Antarctic and the other subantarctic islands. That Southern Ocean, that part of the Southern, there are some parts of the ocean, different parts of the ocean have all sorts of different sort of characteristics that they're really interesting to think about, and things that affect what kind of species you see there. The Southern Ocean is a really interesting place, and for one of the reasons is because the currents and the winds in the Southern Ocean basically just circulate around Antarctica in a never-ending loop, and that creates pretty strong winds, very strong currents, and most of those currents are coming from the west going to the east, and same with the prevailing winds. And because those currents are strong, and because you've got sort of a big water mass up here in the subantarctic versus the Antarctic water mass down here, it sets up this really strong frontal system that goes right through it. But it's not a straight line like you'll see drawn on some maps. It actually kind of wavers back and forth. It spins off and forms eddies and little gyres and sort of sort of all sorts of these little features here. And the color on this map here is showing you sea surface temperature anomaly. So that's warmer colors are warmer than average for that time of year. Cooler colors are colder than average for that time of year. So you can see all these interesting patterns between, eddies that go one direction versus the other, and warm core versus cold core eddies, or meanders, we call them. So there's a lot of oceanography happening in the Southern Ocean. It's a very turbulent place. And that's one of the reasons why it's so productive, why there's so much life there, is because whenever you have turbulence, that tends to mix things up, and that's good for growing plants, which then grows animals. So it's a really interesting environment. And these cruises that travel from South America to the Antarctic Peninsula, they're crossing that boundary, which means they're sampling potentially a lot of different changes in the environment. And over time, this image comes from a particular day in a particular year. A week later, these eddies may have moved hundreds of kilometers, and so we might have a very different scenario along that track line as it's going to and from the Antarctic Peninsula. And so there's some really interesting sort of science to be done just monitoring what's going on in this area. So we're really set up well to have people on these tourist ships collect data for us. Ultimately, what we'd like to do is something like this. Show of hands for those of you I can see in the picture. How many of you have visited the eBird status and trends pages? A few of you. I really encourage you to do it. It's a really great resource. The link is down here. I can email the link, or I can put the link in the chat at the end. But yeah, it's a really cool thing. If you just search for eBird status and trends, you can find it. Basically, for a lot of species around the world, it's not just North America anymore, it's around the world, eBird data can now be used together with information on the habitat to create these really amazing maps through time that show how migration happens from week to week over the course of the year. So this example is ruby-throated hummingbird, and you can see sort of where they're wintering, where they're most abundant, and then we can sort of go forward to right about now, right? I guess that's a little bit later from now. Okay, well, whatever. You get the idea. So you can see where those ruby-throated hummingbirds should be in any week of the year. This is really, really powerful. It allows us to do a lot of really cool stuff in the science and the conservation realm. If you go to the status and trends page, and you can type in your favorite species, see what comes up. There are some species that have a lot of products that have been made. Other species have less information. And if I were to type in the word albatross, of which there's 20 some odd albatross species in the world, I would be very sad, because I would find no status and trends models for albatross of any kind, any species of albatross. So we want to change that. We want to be able to do something like that status and trends model for a lot of seabird species. But this problem where we don't have a ton of data throughout most of the way, we're not really going to be able to do anything for albatross that are here if we don't have data for those albatross. And we're never really going to get to the point where we have a ton of data like we do in North America. The map of the ocean is never really going to look like this, especially for any particular time frame. there's just not enough people, there's not enough ships out there. If there were that many ships, we'd be concerned about other things and the impact of all that shipping. So, we need to make use of less data on the open ocean. How are we going to do that? Well, there are plenty of people that do go out to sea to monitor seabird populations. And the professionals that do that have all sorts of tools that they use, methods they use to do that. The goal in one of these at-sea survey programs is to calculate the density of birds. So you want to calculate basically how many birds per square mile, per square kilometer there are on one patch of ocean. One way that that's often done is with what's called distance sampling. The way this works is as the ship moves along in a straight line, you've got a bunch of distance bands or continuous distance that you're measuring. And as birds are spotted along this path, you're going to record the distance to that bird. Obviously, something like an albatross is very visible from pretty far away. So even 300-400 meters away, you can detect pretty much all the albatross. For something smaller, like a storm petrel, you might not detect all those storm petrels 300 meters from the ship. You might only detect them when they're closer to 150, 100 meters from the ship. And so you have this relationship between the perpendicular distance to the birds as you pass them and the probability of detection. A method like this is designed to collect the data necessary to create this curve so that we can do the correction to know basically what is the actual bird density over the area that I've surveyed. Now, this is biased by movement, and I'll talk a little bit about movement later on. But basically, if we've got birds that are moving through this space, we need to think about that a little bit differently. But there are ways to do that. There are ways that we have to figure that out. But the bottom line is that research vessels are not very common. So a research vessel like this NOAA ship here, that may be able to do seabird surveys for certain weeks out of the year when it's not doing other oceanographic work. They may be able to do it on each of the NOAA vessels, but there just aren't that many research ships out there. And so if we can increase the amount of data that we're getting from the oceans, maybe we can do a little bit more with some of these bird distribution maps. So that brings me to my current postdoc at the Cornell lab. And this is a partnership with Viking Expeditions. Viking Expeditions is a sort of new arm that's just a few years old of the Viking Cruise Company. And they have built these two new ships, Viking Octantis and Viking Polaris. And in the summer, in the Northern Hemisphere summer, at least up until recently, I'm not sure what the plan is for the next few years, but up until recently, they've been doing cruises of the Great Lakes, which might be of interest to folks if they're interested in doing a cruise around the Great Lakes. And then during the austral summer in, say, early November through March, they're down in the Antarctic doing trips to and from Antarctica. So we partnered with Viking to go aboard their ships and to collect data directly on the birds that we were seeing, but also to be able to compare to eBird data that are also coming from ships, both the Viking ships and other ships similar to them. So that's the goal of this project, and I was brought on to basically help run this project to compare eBird data to validation or calibration data that we were going to collect ourselves from these ships. So what we did is collect some of those traditional marine bird surveys from the bridge of the Viking ships, and we had eBird data being collected at the same time. Basically, when we were collecting a traditional survey, the traditional surveys only collect data within a certain distance from the ship because of that distance sampling aspect of it. But an eBird survey, obviously, you're trying to collect data on all the birds you see. So we had kind of two categories. We had the one category of birds where we were collecting things like distance, and we were able to calculate a density from that. And then all the other birds have been seen at the same time. And from that, we can create an eBird version of that same survey. So we can directly compare what I would have seen if I was just doing an eBird survey with what I saw during that traditional bird survey. And we had a bunch of other people doing eBird at the same time, not only on our ships, but on other ships in the same area at the same time frame. Now, the traditional bird surveys are going to account for distance, like I spoke about. It's also going to account a little bit for movement. The eBird surveys, we wanted them to do a little bit more because we're thinking that we might want to have people that are going to sea on ships collect a little bit more effort information than you normally collect. If you go on the eBird app and hit start, You're collecting something about the distance you travel, the number of observers, the duration of the checklist, but there might be some other pieces of information that might be really important in being able to help us correct these data. And one of those is the vantage point on the ship. Another might be what birds are following the ship. I'll talk a little bit more about both of those. So we had the people who are doing eBird data collect a little bit of extra data in the comments with the idea that we might want to turn that into a separate protocol in the future. Then sort of basically, we did that for 2 seasons. We did that in February of March in 2022. That was Viking's first year operating in the Antarctic. And so there was a little bit of a trial season. We were on board for just a couple of voyages. And then back in November 2022 through March 2023 was our main data collection effort. And together we collected, these are all of those distance sampling line transects we collected sort of throughout, I think 8 total cruises that we were on board for. So pretty good effort. You can see there's some areas where the ship is traveling sort of nonstop from point A to point B. And obviously there are some periods where it's dark out and we can't collect data on birds we can't see. So this is nighttime here, and you know, some of this up here is nighttime as well. Generally, we would leave from Ushuaia, Argentina, go out through the Beagle Channel, turn south. Usually this would be the end of the first day, and then the morning of the sea day, we have us either here or here, collect some data, go to bed, and then the next day we'd wake up and we'd be approaching the Antarctic. On the way back, generally we're collecting data in sort of this area here. So that was sort of how these cruises typically ran. We got a good amount of data. And I talked a little bit about some of the things that we needed to correct for. One of those things is motion. And so this is something that's been known for a long time. If we're doing a line transect, a sort of a measurement of seabird density, if you encounter birds that are flying, that are moving, you're going to be encountering them at different rates depending on the relative direction of motion. And you can think of this as driving down the highway. If you're talking about all the other cars as birds, all the other cars that are traveling with you, you're only going to be counting the ones that are sort of gradually going past you, or if you've got a lead foot, the ones that you are gradually going past. Whereas you're going to be seeing a lot of cars going in the opposite direction, zooming past you in the opposite lane. And so if you are recording birds that are flying relatively from behind you, overtaking you, the density is going to be biased very low. Whereas if you're recording birds that are flying at you, your density is going to be biased very high. So we know we have to account for the relative motion. And that people have done before. There are published ways of doing that. But we were trying to combine our data, our transect data, with, or we were trying to combine this method of correcting for relative motion with these distance sampling methods. And oddly, a lot of people hadn't really done a lot of work on using those distance sampling methods on flying birds. Often the traditional bird surveys will not do flying birds with those distance sampling methods. They'll do distance sampling for the birds that are on the water and use other methods to account for the flying birds. The reason for that is because there is quite a lot of bias in those distance sampling methods. You can think about that like this. So if you have birds that are going parallel to you, you're going to see a certain number of birds in each of these distance bands. And obviously, if your detection probability is lower, the further you get from the ship, you're going to see fewer birds out there. One of those traditional sort of distance sampling approaches, or the traditional way of doing this, is going to use this information to help you fit this curve, to basically use the data to know what this relationship is so you can correct for it. But if you imagine birds that are flying across this far edge here, you're actually going to wind up overrepresenting the birds in this column, because those birds are going to be flying through here and you're going to notice them before they get to this place over here. So the birds that are flying from this direction are going to be overrepresented in that outer band. And you're not going to be able to basically figure out, well, how high should this be for the birds that I might not have detected here? You're not going to be able to fit a curve like this to data like that. And if you think about birds coming from the other direction, you're going to have the opposite problem. You're going to overrepresent the birds in this initial band here. You're going to underrepresent these, because most of the birds that would eventually show up here are getting counted as soon as they enter this first one. And so you can't really fit this curve using the traditional method. So as much as I wanted to start this postdoc and sort of go right into looking at the eBird data, we actually had to figure out this problem first, and that has taken quite a while. And we're just getting done with the process of doing that, and we're working on that paper actually right now. When I end the call, I'm going to have to do more work on my draft. So this turned out to be quite a tricky problem to solve, and we're basically having to invent a new method to do this. But we've got our handle on it, and we think we've got a pretty good solution for it now. And basically what we've done is we've got the bird counts under certain conditions. We can come up with whatever those relative proportions per band are. We've also taken some data on the direction and the speed of the birds. So we know something about which birds were flying from different directions, make some assumptions about the speed. And what we can do then is we can come up with that detection probability per band using this new method. It's not a question mark anymore. I figured it out. And from there, we can get our apparent density and then correct for that relative motion, that birds coming at you versus birds going with you sort of correction. So a lot of math involved in basically just figuring out what seems like should be a simple question. How many birds are there? But we should have that pretty well sorted now. So over the summer, I'll be able to sort of take that density information and move on. The way we wound up doing this is with simulations. So we're able to simulate birds of a particular direction, a particular speed, at a particular density. And then we can test this method I've come up with different truths, different real, sort of different scenarios to evaluate how well it works and basically how big of a sample size we need to have confidence in our results. So we've done that work and are working on getting that published right now. So I'm pretty proud of that work. So that gets us this side of the box. What about this other side? What about the eBird data? Well, we have all those eBird data from when we were down in the Antarctic. We got those data from a number of things. I mentioned a couple of those sort of factors we might want to account for. One of those is vantage point. So here's my colleague, Charlie. Charlie and I were the ones actually doing the observations, and we were doing all those professional observations, the distance sampling from the bridge. That's the place that makes the most sense to do those, and where most seabird survey type protocols happen, either the bridge or a flying bridge above it. On the ship itself, eBird data come from all sorts of places on the ship. You might have sort of guests that are on board that are standing out here up elevated on deck 5 on this little promenade deck looking out. This is a great place to watch birds. You're a little bit out of the wind there on the side. In good weather, they might be out on the bow looking out. This is another great place to see birds. And that was a place that was specially built on these ships. A lot of ships have bows closed off. There's just a lot of machinery there. On this ship, the bows open when the weather is good and the waves aren't crashing over the bow for people to go out and do some wildlife watching. And then often when the seas are rough and the bow is closed, a good place to go out is back by the stern, and you can look out over the water that you're passing. Or here down on this little deck down here. So there's a bunch of places around a cruise ship where people might be bird watching and collecting eBird data. And there's a lot of potential for differences in what birds they're recording. One of the main reasons for that is that birds follow ships. So this snowy albatross or wandering albatross, this bird was following the ship one day. That's how I managed to get a good picture. Well, I got some pictures, maybe not quite this crisp, of wandering albatross. This comes from the Macaulay Library. We don't know who the photographer was for this one, but you can get these pictures because the birds are flying right behind the bow or the stern of the ship. So if you're up here, you might not actually see some of those birds as well, and you might not count them as you might count the birds that you're seeing off in the distance, but you might not get as good views. So you might not realize some of those birds are following you. If you're back here, you might not see some of the birds that are flushing away from the ship, some of the small birds on the water. If you've got a penguin on the water that dives as soon as the ship approaches, you might not see that from back here, but you'll get very good looks at the albatrosses or the giant petrels that are following the ship. So if you're collecting an eBird checklist in one place or another, that might be useful information to have that will allow us to model those data a little bit better, to understand sort of the variation between one checklist and the next. So those are some of the pieces of information that we've got, and I'll be working with an undergraduate over the summer at Cornell to help sort of look at those data and get a slightly better idea of what kind of patterns are in those data. But even before we do that, we can see some interesting patterns. So here are some preliminary data that we have on 2 species. These are both 2 species of Pterodroma petrels. Well, I guess this is a Pterodroma petrel. This is not closely related, but in the same sort of tube nose family. This is the blue petrel, and then this is the soft plumaged petrel. Both of them are quite common to see in the Southern Ocean. But it turned out, once we actually started looking at the data, that they're not always common to see in the Southern Ocean. So these are data just from January to March. We've got some data from November as well, but basically in all the way through November up until sort of late January, blue petrels are very, very common. And this we can tell from the bridge transects that we had. We had a lot of blue petrels on this trip right here. We had a couple of them that last trip in January. And then after that, we had nothing up until the very sort of middle of March. We had maybe one or two blue petrels here. But there was a very stark difference between sort of mid to late January and earlier versus February and March. Contrast that with the soft plumage petrel down here. We have essentially 0 soft plumage petrels up until February, a couple coming in late January. And then once you get into sort of the middle of February, there's lots of soft plumage petrels. These are data from places on the ship. The eBird data from the bridge is during this because we saw the same birds in those. My internet connection might be unstable. Hopefully you've got that. Basically, what I was saying is that you've got this really big shift between when you see blue petrels and when you see soft plumage petrels, and then and that's pretty much mirrored in the eBird data from other places on the ship. So even if you're collecting eBird data from other vantage points, you're still kind of picking up this signal, and that tells us that the eBird data are probably pretty good at showing at least these really dramatic patterns. And the fact that we've got some mysterious patterns here that have not really been accounted for. To my knowledge, no one has ever published on this sort of temporal pattern in these two species from the Drake Passage. So this is really interesting new data that we're going to be able to add to the scientific literature. And we'll be working on doing this sort of comparison as I finish up the postdoc before I move to Maine at the end of the summer. So things that we have to do, I mentioned we're working on this paper to talk about the detection process and dealing with movement and that new method we came up with. That's in the works right now. We're hopefully going to get that submitted soon. We're going to compare the density data that we have from the bridge to the eBird data to do that calibration. We're going to do that for a few test species to validate that the calibration works. We're probably going to start with blue petrel and soft plumage petrel. It seems like a great place to start to document this pattern. We'll try and publish some basic distribution maps with those data, that transect data and the eBird data that we have. And the goal then is to help inform the status and trends team at Cornell so that they can start using some of this information to better model seabirds in the future. And we may have to start with places with a lot of data like the Southern Ocean, but ultimately what we'd like to do is be able to make status and trend maps for seabirds around the world so we can know what's going on with Atlantic puffins in the North Atlantic, or Sabine's gulls off the west coast of the US. So all these sorts of things that we'd like to know that we just can't right now. But obviously, I can't collect a lot of data on my own. We need to collect more data. And we'd like eBird data to be collected in the most useful ways possible and by more and more people. So birders that already know eBird are going to continue to travel to the Antarctic, and we'll continue to get data that way. But we want to expand that. And so I've been working with a group called the Polar Citizen Science Collective, which is a sort of an organization that is designed to help staff members on expedition ships do citizen science projects with their guests. So people who may not have any interest in birds are going to be going on these trips. They want to see icebergs in the Antarctic, but on the way, while they're taking a day or two to cross the Drake Passage, they're going to be looking at birds. And they're going to be learning something about those birds. And we want the staff members on board to get them excited about collecting data. There might be birders who have never used eBird before. People in the US, birders tend to already be adapting to eBird pretty well. But in other parts of the world, there are a lot of birders who that just isn't part of the birding culture in those countries. They might get exposed to eBird for the first time in the Antarctic. So we want to be able to have trained expedition staff who know the birds, who can ID the birds well, to help those people get introduced to eBird, and for those staff members to start collecting data themselves. So this program trains those staff members in how to use eBird, in not just how to use eBird, but how to collect some of those ancillary data like vantage point or following birds and the checklist comments. So we have a training that I put together online. The staff members take that training and they submit data to eBird. And this is just the data I got in the 2022-23 season that we'll be working with. We got more data coming in last year. I wasn't in the Antarctic last season, but we had a bunch of other people in the Antarctic collecting these data, and we're going to continue to do that in the future. So I'm really excited to continue to work with the Polar Collective on that. The other thing that I've been working on, I spent a good part of last summer doing, was working on the filters that eBird uses. So anywhere you go in the world, eBird has an automatic filter that determines what you see on your list when you hit start a checklist and you see a list of birds that comes up. That is one of the best ways we have to quality control the data, because that means that someone who's submitting a checklist knows right away which birds are rare and they should add some comments or get some documentation for. Up until recently, that was not possible on the ocean. And I don't have time to really go into why, but suffice it to say, eBird data quality was lacking on the ocean because people weren't getting the best filter for their area. What we needed to do was design a bunch of these polygons to add another layer of filters to the eBird database, so that when you're out on a ship in the middle of the South Atlantic, for example, you get a list of birds on your app that actually is realistic for what you're going to expect to see there. So this took quite a bit of work, but is something that I managed to get done. And those are now being implemented. We have to design all the filters for them, and we've pretty much done the open high seas areas of the Atlantic. We've done parts of the Pacific, and we're adding more in the next few weeks, hopefully. And then we're going to be continuing to add these pelagic regions around. I am responsible. I'm one of the reviewers for the high seas, so everything outside of 200 nautical miles from shore, and then all these other little bubbles you see around islands or along the shoreline, along the coastlines. Those are areas within 200 nautical miles that fall into the reviewer queues of the people who are reviewers for those regions. So the Australian reviewers are reviewing data that are coming from these. The Argentinian reviewers are reviewing these data here. When we did this process, I said, well, I can do it for the high seas. And then they said, well, if you're going to do it for the high seas, how much more work would it take to design all these other little bubbles for all the world's countries and then sometimes states or even counties when you get down to the West Coast here? And I said, well, kind of a lot actually, but it's worthwhile. So I spent a good part of last summer doing that. And it turned out to be really, really useful. And hopefully that will be really, really helpful for folks. If you want to learn more about this, actually, I don't know if you saw, they did a reviewer spotlight on me on the eBird website not too long ago. So I can paste this link in the chat as well. You can go to that link, and I answered a few questions about that process and how I went about it and sort of the background for why that was important. So that's all I've got for you tonight. I've got a lot of people that have helped make this work possible. Ali Johnston is at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. She was at the Cornell lab for a while as a research associate before she got her faculty position at St. Andrews. And so she and I have been working very closely together. She and Wes Hachachka, who's at the Cornell lab, those have been my two sort of primary science advisors to the project. Charlie Wright was the person you saw in that first photo doing bird surveys. He came down to the field with me. And then Christopher Wood, the eBird person who runs the eBird project, he's been very instrumental. He's kind of he's technically my supervisor at the lab, and was really instrumental in getting the sort of partnership with Viking going, so that my project was funded, and so we had their support. And the funding, all the funding for my postdoc came from Viking Expeditions, so big thanks to them. Charles Eaton and Steve Buckland are some other folks at University of St. Andrews and University of Manchester that are working with us on some of the math. And then obviously all the staff and crew at Viking that helped make the fieldwork possible. Big shout out to them. Yeah, so I am very happy to take questions or chat more, or I don't know, pull up pictures and talk about Antarctic or Southern Ocean birds if you want. Thanks very much.
Okay, do we have any questions for Michael?
Well, do you already see any trends in any of the areas that you've been examining in bird populations?
Yeah, trends in bird populations. We certainly don't have enough eBird data really, or we haven't done the work on the eBird data enough to know if the eBird data are showing any trends. We do see trends in some of the birds that are breeding in the Antarctic, and for that I'm relying on the work that I was doing for my PhD. A lot of the work that's been done on the colonies. There's actually a long history of doing surveys of nesting sites, and from that work, we know that there's all sorts of interesting patterns. Particularly, what we know about are the penguins. We know that some species of penguins are increasing in population. Well, one species of penguin is increasing in population, the Gentoo penguin, which is a little bit more of a southern, sort of a sub-Antarctic species that has been expanding in the Antarctic Peninsula as climate change has affected. The Antarctic Peninsula has been affected sort of essentially as much by climate change as the Arctic has, or almost as much. It's a place that has seen a lot of warming in the last several decades. Other parts of Antarctica weirdly haven't seen as much warming yet. That's partly to do with the fact that climate change is causing Southern Ocean winds to get stronger on average. And that is having interesting effects in terms of the isolating effect that has and the oceanography. So there are some parts of the Antarctic that haven't warmed as much as others. And in fact, some areas where you're getting more sea ice weirdly than you have in the past. That has been the case up until the recent past. I think just in the last few years, we're starting to get past that, and climate warming is becoming more of a thing in lots of parts of the Antarctic. But so certainly there are some sort of results from that. A lot of the birds that we see in the Southern Ocean are sorry, I was talking about the penguins. The other two species of brush-tailed penguins, the Adelie penguin and the chinstrap penguin, in the Antarctic Peninsula, both of their populations have been declining quite a bit, which we think is largely due to these climate changes, although there's other food web related things that might be also at play there. A lot of the birds we see in the Southern Ocean, like the albatrosses, they are breeding on the subantarctic islands, and those haven't been as affected by climate change yet. Particularly because they're so influenced by the ocean environment that they're much more moderate in temperature anyway. And so we haven't seen a lot of climate change impacts, at least on the breeding side of things. There certainly are food web related changes, and the jury is still out on exactly how those are going to play out. There are some subantarctic species that are changing how far they travel or where they travel. But a lot of those birds, like the albatross, are so used to long distance travel anyway, that moving a few extra 100 kilometers north or south may not actually be that much of an energy change to them. So they might be able to buffer a shift in where they find food. Once you start changing the amount of food, then that has another effect. So at the moment, for a lot of those albatross species, the biggest threats are still introduced predators and bycatch from fisheries. Depending on what species you're talking about, climate change is certainly having an impact. And so we're seeing we have a lot of data from breeding colonies, and I would say that breeding colonies, there are the traditional ways of monitoring breeding colonies with scientists visiting or staying at those places and collecting data themselves. That's probably always going to be a slightly more efficient way of understanding what's going on for those populations, just by the nature of the way seabirds breed and the fact that you can send one scientist to an island and they can get all the information on the whole population. eBird is less useful in that situation, because you just don't get eBirders visiting islands all that much, and because actually eBird is kind of difficult to use. It's hard to get an accurate count of a seabird colony with an eBird checklist. And so there's a lot of factors there that make eBird less useful for that particular scenario. But I think using eBird to monitor where things are at sea, that is going to be very, very useful. We just need to know how to calibrate them correctly. And basically, we know that there's going to be a lot of variability in eBird data. The question is, how many data do you need before you can say something with authority? And that's what we don't know yet. That's what my work is hopefully going to lead to. In terms of anecdotal trends, I have definitely noticed, you notice things, at least more from the environment than anything else. You notice when, there there just aren't as many of something as you used to see. I haven't been working in the Antarctic as long as some other people have. Some of the guides that I worked with who started working in the Antarctic in the 1990s, they definitely were able to say like, oh yeah, like you used to be able to see thousands of birds at this, at a site like this. So anecdotally, I haven't been working in the region long enough to really get that long-term perspective, but it is something that there are trends happening, that is for sure.
What else? Do seabirds stop on icebergs?
Do seabirds stop on icebergs? They do. There are kind of two main types of icebergs that you see in the Southern Ocean. One type is a piece that comes off of a montane glacier. So if you think of kind of your classic glacier sliding down through a bay onto the water, you've got pieces of that glacier that calve off, relatively small piece. I mean, they can still be as big as a house, but relatively small pieces. Those icebergs are relatively small and fairly easy for birds to sort of climb up on from the water. So often you'll see penguins, for example, roosting on icebergs of that size that you see floating around the Antarctic. Once those icebergs get out to sea, they're kind of rolling around a lot more, and it's harder for a bird to, say, perch on one. So you probably don't see them out on the open ocean as much. The iceberg also gets broken up a lot faster at that point. The other kind of iceberg that we have are what are called tabular bergs. And I don't know if I have a picture of it. I'll just pull up. I have control over the screen. I can just share my browser. So a tabular iceberg is sort of what you would see, sort of one of these classic, oh, come on. I don't want to purchase the photo. Anyway, get the idea. It's one of these giant icebergs that basically come off of an ice shelf, which is a big sheet of ice that has, flowed down off of a continental glacier out onto the ocean surface. And a chunk of that can sometimes calve off. And those can be massive. When you see the news stories about like the biggest iceberg ever has just calved off, those are tabular icebergs. And the reason they're so flat on top is because they were formed from these big continental glaciers that have slowly slid off, and then a chunk will break off. And those chunks can be the size of islands, basically. Those will often, because they're stable, because they're big enough to be stable at sea, on the open ocean, you'll often see birds roosting on the top of them. So it's a great place to find snow petrels. They like to fly around the base of these and perch at the top. Antarctic petrels as well will sometimes perch up there. A couple times I've seen big flocks of say 50 or 60 Antarctic petrels on the top of a tabular berg as we've sailed past. And then the last kind of ice that you see in the Antarctic is sea ice. And sea ice is the ocean surface that freezes. So icebergs come from land, break off of ice that has formed on land. Sea ice forms when the ocean surface itself freezes. And that is never usually more than a few meters thick. Sometimes you'll get sea ice that will stay frozen throughout the summer, and then it'll get added to the following year. You'll get multi-year sea ice, which is a little bit thicker, but it never really sticks up more than a meter or two above the water's surface. And you regularly see birds roosting on sea ice as well. Penguins, as well as other birds, will often roost on sea ice. Yeah.
How many years of data do you think it's going to take before you get let's say, a reasonable level of accuracy in your predictability?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it entirely depends on how many checklists come from a particular place. So in the Drake Passage, for example, there are probably interesting patterns that we can pick out with just 1 year of data. I'll look at the Polar Collective data that we had from 2022, 23. I have a strong suspicion that we'll be able to see, say, that blue petrel pattern just with that 1 year's worth of data. But there's very few places in the world where we have as dense a collection of eBird checklists as we do in the Drake Passage. Elsewhere, I think we're probably going to need several years of data together. Yeah, a lot depends on the species. If you've got a common species that's easy to identify, that a lot of people see, you're going to have more records of that species. It'll be a little bit easier to pull things out. But if you've got a rare species that only gets seen, once in a while, which is common for a lot of seabirds, you might need, 10, 20 years of data before you can really get that. Fortunately, we do actually have a good amount of data. eBird went global in, I forget exactly when, 2005 or 6 or so, somewhere around there, is my guess. And since then, people have been going to sea collecting data. Back before the app, people would just record data on their notebooks, and when they got back to shore after a cruise, they would enter all those notebooks. As the app came along, it got a little bit easier to collect multiple checklists at more specific locations, and that's very, very useful for work like I do. A day list of all the birds you saw on a particular day of a cruise might be useful in some circumstances, but it doesn't give you that really fine scale information that is a little bit more helpful when you're trying to model habitat associations, for example. So I think, since the app has been around, I think that we've been regularly getting a good amount of data from people who are really serious about it, and the data is just going up and up and up. So I suspect that we'll be at the point where for some parts of the ocean that get a lot of traffic, we'll be able to do something interesting with just a few years of data for the species that get seen a lot.
I have a question. eBird referees are sensitive to the linear distance that you take data on land.
Mhm.
So you've got people on boats and they're watching birds, they're taking data. So what kind of linear distance do you want them to go through before they start a new checklist? How do you, because you want to know where the birds are on the ocean.
Yep.
You don't want to know for the whole trip.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you do that?
So I have two answers to that question, and one is with my reviewer hat on, and one is with my scientist hat on. With my reviewer hat on, I would say obviously shorter checklists are better. Now, there's a limit to, like, if you're doing a new checklist every 5 minutes on the ocean, that's probably overkill. That's a lot of effort that you're putting into pressing buttons and not looking at birds. My rule of thumb that's kind of more my scientist hat. As a reviewer, basically, I will accept something technically, anything that you submit. On land, it gets a little bit trickier, and there's like those guidelines for number of miles or whatever. On the ocean, we're a little bit more lenient, and we don't want to go back. Obviously, there's a lot of historical data that are collected in day lists that are useful. There are data, as a reviewer, I reviewed some checklists that someone put in from someone who was a birder on a Liberty ship in World War II and recorded data in his notebook on the birds he was seeing while they were transiting from North America to Europe to fight in the war. That's incredibly valuable data. I'm not going to go through and get rid of those data just because it covers an entire day's worth of things. As long as the eBird rules say it needs to be specific to the day, and it needs to have a specific location. So if the location of that checklist is reasonably located roughly where you were during that day, and the day is correct, like those were all birds you saw during that day, technically that's okay. Now, as a scientist, when I go and use the data, if I'm trying to do habitat modeling with some of those eddies or something like that, I'm going to filter the data out. And even though it's in the database, like it can be in the database, and then as a scientist, I'll go through and say, apply a filter, and any checklist longer than this number of kilometers is going to be removed for this analysis. I will usually, I don't know exactly what I'm going to wind up doing. That's going to be part of what I kind of play around with and investigate in the data. My suspicion is that if you're, say, more than 25 to 50 kilometers or so, you're starting to get into the realm of not being precise enough for the work that I'm going to want to do. But there might be other projects that can accept a little bit longer distance. My rule of thumb is try to start a new checklist every hour. That's usually a pretty good balance between amount of button pushing on the app versus data quality. And most ships travel at the speed that most ships are traveling. You're not going to really cover too much distance in that hour to be covering multiple habitat areas. Basically, it'll basically be the same type of habitat. And if you're crossing a boundary into a new habitat, you'll only have just done that within that hour. The checklists that I collect are often a half-hour long. That's the sweet spot I find for my own data collection. And I recommend that people don't go more than an hour. But if someone submits like, you know, a 3-hour checklist, that's, you know, that might be useful in certain circumstances. So as a reviewer, I'm pretty lenient on the open ocean lists for distance, as long as it's specific to the day and as long as the effort information is correct. So if you recorded birds for 12 hours, but you said you only traveled 1 mile, that's obviously not correct. And so that's, you know, that I'm going to make that checklist not public because the effort data doesn't match, you know, the distance doesn't match the duration. Well, I'll probably send you an email asking if you actually have the real data. And then if you don't get back to me, then I will make the checklist not public.
One more quick question. I took a ship from Florida to Cartagena, Colombia, and I watched the sea looking for birds, and I didn't find any. So I put no eBird checklist in, but the
Yep.
data was, I didn't find any birds.
Yep.
So at sea, do you tell people how you want them to put data in? I assume it would be valuable to know there were no birds,
Yep.
but I didn't put it.
I would be really curious to go into the database and look for this record. I think I'm probably in the running for the person with the largest number of 0 bird checklists in eBird.
Okay.
I have done that many, many times. In the Southern Ocean, it's not quite as common. We have had a few. We have had a few checklists that we collected in the Antarctic in the Drake Passage, where we've traveled for a half hour and saw 0 birds, and that goes in the database. Checklist with 0 birds. I encountered that a lot when I worked for the Woods Hole Sea Semester program, and we were sailing through places like you were talking about. So in my case, we were sailing through the North Pacific Gyre or the North Atlantic Gyre, like the Sargasso Sea area. And there it's quite common to go an hour or 2 without seeing a bird. And yeah, if you traveled for a half hour, an hour, you traveled 10, 15, 20 miles, and you didn't see any birds, that is totally legitimate data. And I love it when I see those checklists. I don't actually see them as a reviewer because there's no records to review. So, but yeah, I would say if that is what you actually saw, if you detected 0 birds, put it in. I do the same thing at night. I'll go out owling, and I have the worst, aside from that great gray owl I found last weekend, I have the worst luck finding owls. I should add, I didn't actually find the great gray owl. The person driving the car found the great gray owl, and I was along for the ride. But yeah, you know, I'll often go out owling and detect 0 birds after an hour of owling, and that's a legitimate checklist. It is what you were able to detect in the area at that time, and that goes into the models, and that helps you model, you know, when you do see a checklist with a bird, you know, it helps get that correct.
Anyone else? Well, Michael, thank you very much for being with us from Winnipeg. It's
Yeah.
about what, 5 o'clock there, maybe?
No, it's only an hour behind you, so
Oh, okay.
it's only,
Well, you didn't lose much with us then.
no. It was still after dinner.
There you go. Well, thank you very much, and good luck in Maine.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, if you have any questions, or if you'd like any of the links that I showed, just yeah, have David send me an email, and I'd be happy, to
Sure.
send any emails. Yep.
Thank you
Awesome.
again. Have a good-
Take care. Good birding. Happy e-birding. Enjoy the Global Big Day on Saturday. Hopefully all of you are out collecting eBird data.